Good afternoon. Welcome. We're glad that you're joining us today for another research colloquium of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. This is another of our spring 2021 colloquia. I want to thank Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum, the digital hub at Virginia Tech, and also Dominique Francesca, who is the business manager for the Center for Humanities, for their work to make this possible. We're especially delighted today to have with us Dr. Clara Suong. Dr. Suong is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech. She's also a deputy director of the Tech for Humanity Lab for computational social science initiatives. She studies the role of information and technology in international relations using computational, formal, and experimental methods. Dr. Suong received a PhD in political science from the University of California in San Diego, and she completed postdoctoral appointments at NYU and Duke University. Her work has received support from the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. So we're very excited to have you with us today. I just want to remind our audience that we will be asking you to send us your comments and questions, particularly. We'll take time about halfway through to relay your questions to Dr. Suong so that she can respond to those. But in the meantime, we want to welcome you, Dr. Suong, and say we're very delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, sorry.
Yes, I'm wondering if we might begin by having you just to tell us how you became interested in a career that focused on international relations.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Sylvester and the Center for the Humanities for having me. I'm really excited to talk about my current research and interests. Yeah, so I got, I guess, first of all, my interest, I'm interested in studying international politics, especially about international security issues. So like international and national security issues. And so I belong to this political subfield, political science subfield called international relations. And international relations is one of the 5 main subfields within political science. And so there are like 5 subfields, and there's IR, international relations, and there's also other subfields like American politics, comparative politics, political theory, and political methodology. Yeah. So international relations scholars basically study the political and economic relations between countries. And they also study sort of like factors that influence these political and economic relations between countries and other entities, such as individuals and international organizations, etc. Yeah. So I study international relations, but I also see myself as an applied political methodologist. So the subfield of political methodology basically studies the quantitative and qualitative methods to study politics effectively. So what I do in my own work is apply various quantitative methods to study issues in international relations and especially international security. Yeah. So that was like a brief intro, I guess. So the reason I got interested in international relations, I guess, is personal, like many academics are sort of like first introduced to these fields. So in college, I majored in anthropology, and anthropology was a really interesting field, and I learned a lot from it. But I also realized that I wanted to sort of like study the role of formal political institutions. I wanted to study actors who have power. And I also wanted to study political implications of these power dynamics. So I basically, I guess I developed an interest in the darker worlds. So in college, I happened to take a class that focused on applying formal methods, applying game theoretic methods to study political science. So that was my sort of first exposure to applications of quantitative and formal methods to study politics. So I really got interested in that, and so I also, in addition to those academic interests, I sort of like developed an interest in working in the policy realm. So I got jobs at the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I also interned at the Department of State. So I think these kind of like development of interests sort of like went hand in hand, and I had fun when working in the policy field. But I think one thing that I realized that I missed in the policy world is that when you're working in the policy, sort of like policy arena, you often don't have like a larger framework. So you're encouraged to sort of like develop a regional specialty and like focus on the sort of like a current issues that affect a certain region. And I wanted to develop, I guess I wanted to learn about like the more general framework about international politics. And that's why I ended up, I guess, going to grad school for a PhD.
Well, that's great. There's so many important issues that come up in international politics. You, for example, you have conducted research on information leaks
Mm-hmm.
and government efforts to control how the state is perceived by any number of people in the public. I'm thinking particularly, for example, the Edward Snowden leaks. Those were huge, tremendous. It
Mm-hmm.
caused shockwaves around the world because it was concerning national security,
Mm-hmm.
and there were pretty profound responses
Mm-hmm.
from people throughout many different countries. But you've done
Mm-hmm.
work on this, you've published about it. I'm wondering if you could give us one or two examples of the relationship between information leaks and government control or government responses to indicate how you think these information leaks have influenced
Mm-hmm.
government policy.
Well, so there are a lot of major leaks that happened, major leaks, major sort of like a disclosure of major unauthorized disclosure of classified information about national security and defense. So that's like the formal definition of a leak.
Mhm.
And there, so like in 2010, there were leaks by WikiLeaks,
Mhm.
where Chelsea Manning leaked thousands of diplomatic cables to WikiLeaks, who published them on the website. And then there's the Snowden case, where Snowden leaked a lot of information from the National Security Agency, and publicized that information. And that occurred in 2013. And there are also other cases of leaks by relatively low-level bureaucrats. And so there's like the case of Stephen Kim, who leaked information about how the US would react to additional nuclear tests by North Korea, which I think this leak happened in 2000, I believe, 2010, around 2000. So all these, there are like major leaks, and you could also go back, way back to the 70s, and think about the Pentagon Papers, right? Daniel Ellsberg leaked Pentagon Papers. So there is a long, I guess, history of national security leaks, and I think the start. The start of my research is sort of like the start of my project about leaks. My project about leaks basically started because there were a lot of harmful leaks, but I also realized that there are also a lot of what you would call helpful leaks. So there are leaks. There are leaks that are actually that happened in order to promote certain government policies. There are leaks that happen as a result of bureaucratic infighting. And not all of the leaks actually reveal information that is negative to these governments. So that's these sort of like, this, I guess, focus on negative leaks and the lack of attention on positive leaks were kind of what sort of like started my interest in national security leaks. And so my dissertation and my papers, first, I guess, like they try to sort of like paint a sort of like a picture. They try to sort of like show the landscape of leaks. And in that case, I looked at leaks about drone strikes that were reported in media, and so forth. So, so I guess what I wanted to say is that there is a variety of national security leaks, and some leaks have an impact. They do, I guess, they do persuade the domestic public, right? Some leaks sort of like fizzle out, right? And some leaks are corroborated by, I guess, admission by government officials. So in this case, in this category, there are first the leaks, and then the government officials are, I guess, constrained. They're pressured to respond to these leaks. So the government officials, either admit or deny certain information, and then that could sort of like lead to a policy change. Or I think another category, I guess, like of these leaks that could have an effect is sort of like through the international channel. Some of the leaked information can serve as a signal from one country to another. So in this case, leaks can serve as a warning to a country that is war with the U.S., for example. Yeah. So so for example, you wanted examples. So that's sort of like the general landscape of, I guess, different leaks and their roles, right? So, for example, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was President Carter's national security advisor in the 70s and 80s, he orchestrated actually leaks, and he leaked a memo that was designed to be leaked to the press. And the reason for this orchestrated leaks was actually to prevent the Soviet Union from invading Poland. So at that time in 1980, there was the solidarity crisis. So there were a lot of mass protests in Poland, and these protests were basically spearheaded by this trade union named Solidarity. And at that time, the US government was really worried about the possibility that the Soviet Union may intervene. And so Brzezinski wanted to send a warning signal to the Soviet Union. But if he actually did it publicly, then there's the risk of the conflict, the tension being escalated, right? So because if he actually sort of like warns the Soviet Union publicly, then the Soviet Union actually may experience, I guess, pressure to intervene, because they don't want to give the impression that they're capitulating, so for Brzezinski, leaking a warning, leaking a warning signal was actually very convenient. So it did communicate the US, I guess, warning to the Soviet Union, right? And it also did not escalate any tension, because Brzezinski, can always sort of like provide an excuse that, oh, it was a leak, right? Like it wasn't a public statement, right? So there's the ironically plausible deniability actually gave him a tool to signal to the Soviet Union without escalating the conflict. So I think that's sort of like one example of the usefulness of helpful leaks, like from between countries, right? And leaks can also be a useful tool for governments, especially when they want to communicate a certain message to their domestic public. So, for example, during the Reagan administration, there were a lot of leaks about the Strategic Defense Initiative. And so there are a lot of senior administration's officials who were quoted in the press about how the Strategic Defense Initiative is going very well, and how that is going to be ready by 1983. So there are a lot of positive reports about the Strategic Defense Initiative, when a lot of scientists actually at the time also said, like, it's not going to work. So I think in this sense, leaks by leaks, some of the leaks I believe were actually authorized or implicitly authorized, probably, right? But anyway, so a lot of these leaks actually was a good, I guess, indirect PR tool for the Reagan administration at the time. So that was a long answer, but that's those are some of the examples that I that sort of like illustrate my logic of leaks as a tool.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, because I think most of us, when we hear about these leaks, we probably tend to assume that they're not orchestrated, that they're
Right.
accidental, and often think of them as happening against the will of government. But what your research points to is that although sometimes they are against the will of government actors, at other times they could actually be orchestrated by government in order to present a certain image, or to create a certain political response from foreign or domestic parties. And so it's interesting to see how this has actually become part of statecraft. It's become part of how governments function, and not always an accident. So that's really fascinating example that you give. You've also conducted research on U.S.-Pakistani relations and the role of other Western and non-Western nations in global politics. And I'm wondering if you could share with us what you perceive to be one of the most difficult international policy challenges that's happening today, particularly given your expertise in national security.
Yeah. So I think most scholars would agree that since the end of the Cold War, non-state actors have become a major issue for international security, right?
Mm-hmm.
There have been a lot of terrorist attacks, and there have been a lot of sort of like sub-state conflict. There have been a lot of, I guess, rebel groups or other non-state actors who sometimes may be sponsored by either their own government or like external powers who engage in proxy war, right? So I think those are definitely major issues, right, in terms of international security. And there's also the inequality in terms of resources, economic inequality of resources, and as well as, I guess, sort of like the global global transporter issues like climate change, right? Those are kind of like I think major issues that most political scientists would agree that are, I guess, like major challenges for all or most of the countries, you know. And I think in addition to those, I think what I would add is sort of like the decline of the liberal international order that has been discussed by some political scientists. So unfortunately, the Trump administration and the domestic, I guess, political uncertainties in the U.S. Also have not sort of like helped in terms of preserving the liberal international order, right? So the liberal international order sort of like is the backbone of the liberal international order is sort of like the international institutions, international organizations, which are supposed to constrain countries for the greater good, such as world peace, right? However, I think recently the liberal international order has broken down, right? And the democratic backsliding at the domestic level certainly has not helped it. So I think sort of like the sort of like the nexus of domestic and international politics, the nexus of domestic political crisis and the international political crisis have sort of like compounded this uncertainty, political uncertainty. Yeah. So I think those are some of the, I guess, major challenges that a lot of countries face today.
That makes sense. That certainly is resonant with a lot of the topics most of us will hear about in the news every day. These are huge, complex challenges.
Yeah.
I'm wondering also if you could share with us some of the work that you've done collaboratively. So I was reading about some of your research to develop something called the Freedom of Information Archive database. This is a collection of around 3 million documents. Can you tell us what this is about and the importance of the archive?
Yeah. So when I was a postdoc at NYU, I had the good fortune to work with political scientists and historians on this project. So this project basically started as efforts to create on a searchable online database of major diplomatic documents. And our database basically includes diplomatic documents from the US, as well as some diplomatic documents from the UK and Brazil. And I think in addition to sort of like putting the documents online, we also use some natural language processing and tools to extract information that we deemed important. So we extracted the names of the persons mentioned in the documents. Mm-hmm. We also extracted information about the countries that are mentioned in the documents. So for example, you can sort of like see, when you look at the US diplomatic documents, you can sort of like see which countries the US has paid attention to. So, there are a lot of, there are some discussions about like which country the U.S. government should direct its diplomatic efforts to. And but there hasn't been much work about sort of like I guess measuring the attention. So that's what we sort of like. That's one of the, I guess, applications of our data, the measure of country importance to the U.S.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That certainly is giving people quite a bit of access to understand how these sovereign states have interacted with one another. That's a lot of data. So these archives are certainly becoming more important now. And was also wondering about your teaching. So could you share with us some of the ways that you are engaging with students? I wonder, for instance, whether you think it's becoming easier or more difficult for students to learn the skills that are required to interpret global policy, or what you see the trends being, and what are some of the things that you do in the classroom to introduce your students to understanding international policy?
Yeah. So I think it is becoming both easier and more difficult for students to learn, I guess, learn the skills for, I guess, studying global policy questions. So I think in one aspect, I think it is important for students to develop like deep knowledge and develop some insights about specific issues, right? So I think in this sense, there needs to be, I guess, some sort of like a focus or some specializations by students on sort of like on a sort of like a set of topics or issues, right? But I think increasingly this may be more difficult for students to do, right? It is just, there's just a lot going on. So I think a student nowadays may face more opportunity costs for if they want to actually, if they focus on specific issues. Yeah. So I think that's a bit challenging. But I think the upside is that there are a lot of tools and there are a lot more opportunities for students to pick up other skills. So like skills like technical skills and skills like, skill like learning to deal with data and learning to analyze data and learning to incorporate data into sort of like into their research interests or like for specific issues that are interested. I think those skills are a lot easier to pick up nowadays because of, a lot of tools. Like there are a lot more tools available and a lot more opportunities for students to learn about these skills, like both in and outside of the classroom. And also I think it has become really easier for students to learn foreign languages. I think compared to, I guess compared to before in the past, right? Learning foreign languages and I guess being exposed to different cultures is it's easier, and there are more opportunities for students to do that. So I think that's, in that sense, it has become easier.
That's great.
Yeah. So in the classroom, I think I'm teaching a course called Foundations of Security Environments, and it's a gateway course to the integrated security minor. And in this gateway course, I and other professors who teach this course incorporate simulations. We incorporate policy simulations where students can play the role of a policymakers, and they have to sort of like tackle and respond to various crises that happen on this platform. Yeah, and I think it's a great learning opportunity for students, and it's really fun to teach.
Yeah, I can imagine the kinds of engagements and questions you get with students must be far ranging. And it probably helps that there are a lot of events that are happening currently in the news cycle that allow them to begin to gauge some of the significance of the work that you're doing in class. But I also imagine there'd be some more material that maybe they're not hearing about in the news, or that you're giving them some skills that they otherwise would not have in order to interpret what they're hearing day to day. I want to remind our viewers to please send us your comments or questions, particularly for Dr. Suong, and we will relay those to her so that she can pass those and pass those on so that she can respond to them. One of the things that we were talking about earlier, Claire, was the series of leaks that have occurred over time, and the way the policies have been shaped in order to respond to those changes. So you were pointing out that these leaks are actually occasionally used strategically by governments in order to shape public perceptions or to elicit a certain kind of response from other nations that come to bear on their national security practices. And you were also talking about the some of the growing challenges that we're seeing now in terms of so-called stateless actors, individuals or groups that are not governments per se, but that are able to commit acts of violence using military weapons, bombs, other materials that we might traditionally associate with states and governments. And so it's helpful to hear you describe some of these trends and changes that have been reshaping the international space. So your work has engaged with the technology, particularly, and its significance in the national security space, and so your interest in information is not just information being leaked; it's also the technological side of information and the use of technology infrastructure in national security. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the technology side of this. You are working with the Tech for Humanity Lab as a deputy director, and that lab is conducting research to help people to understand the relationship between technology and human security. So could you say a few things about the way the technology itself is actually reshaping the work that gets done in understanding international policy?
Sure. So the role of technology in terms of within the context of military competition between countries has been documented a lot.
Okay.
There's expansive literature in political scientists about how, I guess, development of, for example, nuclear weapons, right, influence or affected competition between nation states. There's an expansive literature about drone strikes, how drones, how states' ability to launch unmanned strikes actually can help or hurt competition between states, right? So I think the existing literature, the conventional wisdom was that the casualties and the fatalities between that result from sort of like on the ground warfare actually constrains countries from actually waging war against each other. So war used to be very costly, right? War is so costly, especially between countries with nuclear weapons, right? That there's ironically sort of like a Cold War, right? So that's it has a long history of literature. And so drone strikes, scholars have paid attention to drone strikes because drone strikes do result in casualties, but not for their own troops, right? They hurt the civilians and and the targets, right? But they don't occur. There's no fatality for the U.S. troops, right? So there has been some, I guess, literature about that. Let's see, and I think there is fledgling literature about I guess social media, and how social media, I guess, sort of like helps or hurts subnational conflict, right? So, for example, if you look at the Arab Spring, there's also discussion about how Twitter enabled or helped civilians to coordinate with each other and launch protests, right? So, a lot of people, a lot of scholars attribute social media to sort of like spark the Arab Spring, but as you know, the Arab Spring, in most of the countries where the Arab Spring happened, did not lead to sort of like a democratic transition, right? So I think there are still debates about sort of like the long-lasting effect about social media on international sort of like transporter conflicts. But it is on. I think it is a really potentially interesting path for research.
Yeah, clearly so.
Yeah.
We have another question here.
Okay.
Someone is asking, first wants to thank you for a very interesting body of research and work, and wants to ask you, are governments sometimes conflicted about whether a leak is harmful or helpful?
Yeah. I think first of all, I think the government is maybe sometimes conflicted about classifying, I guess, the nature of the leaked information. But I think it is a bit relative, though. I think for like I guess for the adversary or for the public, the government has full information, and I don't think it's actually that difficult for them to exactly distinguish the nature of the information. I think the government may be uncertain about the implications of the leaks, right? There is uncertainty for the government, when figuring out like how their adversary will receive the leaks, right? But that's sort of like, down the road. But I think initially the government is pretty certain. I think that it's not too difficult to distinguish, I think, harmful leaks versus helpful leaks, at least like initially when we just look at the information. I think what the government is conflicted about is, or I think what the government is often conflicted about is like who does the leaking, right? They do have a double standard, I think, about who leaks, right? So I think policy, so like the elites at the top, see the political appointees, and those close to the president definitely are given much more leeway. And the leaks they do are I guess, they're not punished for leaking certain information. I mean, they are often more savvy, and they're often more like, I guess, strategic about the information they leak. But like compared to lower level bureaucrats who leak information, these like top elites have a lot of leeway when leaking information. But it's the government, I think, is quite strict about leaks by lower level bureaucrats. And when you look at all cases of leaks and cases of leakers who are all prosecuted by the government, they're all low level bureaucrats. So there's I think that's what sort of like that dynamic, that underlying dynamic, I think could be confusing to, I think, people outside of the government.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's another question we have from our audience. How should governments deal with misinformation or disinformation.
Mhm.
And they're asking, are there fundamental differences between the way nations deal with this misinformation?
Right. Well, I mean, this is a really $1 million question. Like, this is the $1 million question, right? I think we are all kind of struggling with what to do with the misinformation and disinformation, right? Like in the US, like social media companies are like struggling with, like how to deal with this, right? So I'm actually not sure about the first part of the question myself. It is something that I've been thinking, but haven't really formed an opinion yet. But I can try to answer the second part of the question. So I think there are fundamental differences across countries, right? As you probably know, in the U.S., there's great respect for freedom of speech, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why it is difficult for the US government and US social media companies to have actually a stance and have a sort of like a policy regarding disinformation and misinformation, because you want to regulate it to some extent, but you also want to respect the freedom of the speech, right? So I think that is the dilemma, right? I think other countries do have a more, I guess, strict stance regarding disinformation and misinformation. And this is I think, largely due to their, I guess, political institutions and political norms toward the freedom of the speech too. So for example, like in South Korea is a democracy, right? But there's definitely less respect for the freedom of the speech, right? So you can actually be prosecuted for libel, even if you speak the truth. If that information is true, but harmful to the individual that the information is about, then the, I guess, spreader, the speaker, or the person who revealed that information could still be prosecuted as libel. Yeah. So there is a great degree, I guess, of government's stance toward information in general. And you can go to, like, non-democratic systems, and you can go to, like, the Chinese system, where there's actually active censorship, right? They actually censor not only information that is untrue, but they also suppress information that is also true and hurts the government, right? So that's like the extreme case. There's a great degree of variance, I would say.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we have another question here. Someone thanks you again for the work and sharing your fascinating research agenda. And their question is, do you examine intentional government leaks that serve domestic or perhaps intra-government political interests? For example, do government agencies ever work against each other to promote their own interests using leaks? So, do you see any examples? I'm just adding to this question. For example, any leaks that the National Security Agency might create against the FBI, or the FBI against the CIA, or the CIA against another branch of government or another entity within the government?
Yeah, so there are a lot of leaks that result from sort of like a intra-government bureaucratic infighting. Yeah. So a lot of examples. And I think one thing that comes to my mind is I think there was a leak by a low-level military personnel named, I think, Radford, I think. And he actually leaked information about the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor's Office. And at the time, there was a lot of friction between the military and Brzezinski's office. Yeah. So what this what Radford was told to do actually was to spy on Brzezinski's office. And I think he went as far as stealing some documents from that office and leaking the documents. Yeah. So that's definitely, one of the factors that motivate leaks. And there's also other factors at play. So there's I think some commentators, some journalists have anecdotally documented the evidence of, I guess, personal ego of bureaucrats as a driving force for leaks. So there are some bureaucrats who leaked information because he's resentful that he wasn't promoted. And there are some interviews where the leakers say that leaking itself was very exciting for him. Yeah. So I think sort of like that emotional sort of like aspect, it's like the ego element I think they're also there. Yeah.
This has been very fascinating. I want to thank you again, Dr. Suong, for sharing with us the research that you're doing and helping us to understand some of the more subtle aspects of the role that information is playing in national security practices and things such as the government leaks, the shifting challenges that are happening on a global stage, from stateless actors to the environmental challenges and how those things are impacting some of the work that's happening in national security practice. We're very excited that you're here at Virginia Tech, helping to lead work in the Tech for Humanity Lab and the research in the political science department. You're a research associate with the Humanities Center. It's very exciting ways that you're really enhancing the intellectual life of the university. So again, we thank you for taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
And thanks to our audience for joining us as well. Thank you for your questions and your comments. And we look forward to you joining us next time.
Great. Thank you so much.